Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi everyone. Inshallah, we'll start in about 4 minutes and we'll just wait for other people to join. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So, Alhamdulillah, this is the last of our 4 sessions on the spiritual dimensions of fasting and charity in the Quran. We are, of course, in the last 10 nights of Ramadan, and I hope everyone's Ramadan is going well. And I hope that we all take advantage of these last 10 nights, inshallah, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq in worshiping Him on these last 10 nights in a way that earns us His forgiveness and His mercy and His blessings and allows us to grow further in our connection with Him. So the previous 3 lessons that we took focused primarily on fasting and looking at fasting and the various spiritual dimensions of fasting, how fasting is an act that reminds us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how it is an act that helps us cultivate our souls and ourselves. And we looked at some of the verses in the Quran related to fasting. Today, in this final session that we have, I'm going to be looking at charity and some of its spiritual dimensions and how the Quran speaks about charity specifically. And the reason why I'm focusing on charity, or why I decided that at least one of these lessons should focus on charity is because, of course, we know Ramadan is a month of giving, right? Ramadan is a month that we do primarily associate with the act of fasting, but at the same time, it is really one of those months in which all the acts of ibadah that we tend to identify with our religion come together in this one month, and people engage in these various acts of worship in order to earn the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And charity is one such act. A lot of people usually choose Ramadan as the month in which they give their zakat. And so that is why I wanted to focus on some aspect of charity in these sessions in order for us to get a better understanding of charity within the Islamic tradition. So the two main things that I want to focus on when I look at charity, because charity is a very big topic. There are different forms of charity in our tradition, but I did want to focus on firstly charity as zakat, and secondly charity as generally the act of giving. And what we'll notice as soon as we enter into our discussions on these topics is that they are really a continuation of the themes that we took in previous lessons, right? In previous lessons, we took that the rituals that we engage in help refine and purify our spirit in many ways, right? They refine it by reminding us of something greater than ourselves. They refine and purify our spirits by sublimating our lower selves, by sublimating our nufus, by allowing us to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to submit to Him, and to show Him gratitude. But when we look at purification within the Islamic tradition, and when we look at all the rituals carefully that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated us to perform, or that He has recommended that we perform, then what we really see is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends for us a purification of every aspect of our being and of every aspect that is connected to our human persons, from our heart to our limbs. And this purification, just as it applies to our heart and to our limbs, it also extends to the external objects that have a link to the human being. The food that we consume, the wealth that we gather, the people that we surround ourselves with, all of these have some impact on the level of purification that we are able to attain, and they have an impact in our journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being successful or not. And so when we look at charity, we are looking at something that is connected to the human being, that a human being holds in his hand, that he possesses, and this consequently has some effect on his soul and on his spirit. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set down particular rituals to ensure that this thing that is connected to the human person, this thing that is connected to the human being, also aids in his purification and does not become a means for the sullying of his soul. And so we're going to start firstly with zakat, right? This is the first thing that we'll start with, which is one of the five pillars of Islam, as we know. Unlike fasting, which we mentioned only appears a handful of times in the Qur'an, and in many contexts appears as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligates in contexts where some expiation for some wrongdoing or some error or some sin is being committed. Zakat, on the other hand, appears over 80 times in the Quran. And many of those times it appears alongside the most salient ritual of Islam, which is the prayer. In Surah Baqarah, if you read the very beginning of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts it by defining who the muttaqeen are, the people of piety, taqwa, which is something that we covered in previous sessions, that they are people who stand up to pray, right? They stand in prayer, yuqimuna as-salah, they establish the prayer, وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ, and they give of what we have provided them. And so from the very beginning, from the very get-go in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets out prayer and charity as the twin pillars, or the two most salient rituals of the ummah. And we'll see the various reasons why charity is so important and why it has been given such importance in the Quran. But one of the things that I wanted to really hone in on is the rules of zakat. And by rules, I don't necessarily mean that we're going to have, some discussion on the various fiqhi aspects of how zakat is given and whom zakat is given to. We're going to touch upon those, but we want to touch upon those with a view to how every aspect of zakat, from the word itself, from the word zakat itself, to all the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set down for zakat, expresses a deeper spiritual idea that sometimes we tend to overlook, or sometimes we tend to not focus on in our desire to fulfill the legal requirements, the minimal legal requirements that are needed in order for our zakat to be considered valid. But when you reflect on some of these rules of zakat, you will see how zakat is acting as something that purifies the human being. And so the three things that we'll look at when it comes to zakat are, firstly, the word itself, meaning the definition of zakat. Secondly, what zakat is given on. And thirdly, to whom zakat is given. And we'll try to focus on, as I said, how these aspects of zakat actually express deeper ideas and reveal to us how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to purify us and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing us to connect to Him on a much deeper level. Now, when it comes to the first issue, which is the definition of zakat, zakat is linked to the word tazkiyah, which means purification. It also is linked to the word zakat, which means increase. And so it comes both in the meaning of purification and it comes in the meaning of increase. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam that خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرْهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا, that take from their wealth in order to purify them and in order to increase them as well. And so in the Quran already, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets down this idea that charity, that sadaqah, has this aspect of tathir and it has this aspect of tazkiyah, right? It has an aspect of purification. It has an aspect of cleansing the inner soul of a person. And in the process, it allows the person to increase. The purification that is primarily meant is the purification of the wealth of the person, right? So a person pays charity on his wealth in order to purify his wealth. And in the process, he experiences an increase, which is an increase in his own provision. This idea of increase is very, very prominent in the Quran because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He constantly reminds the human being of is that He is the one who sets down the rules of this world. There is a sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is sometimes counterintuitive to the human being, but which a person who truly believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recognize and will submit to. And the idea of increase that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expresses in the Quran is the idea that it is in fact charity. It is in fact you giving away a portion of your wealth with the intention of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that results in the increase of your own provision and the increase of your own state. Whereas the disbeliever, the person who does not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who does not understand the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is the one who looks at the zahir, he looks at the external reality, and he sees giving as an act of you are departing with something. And so you are coming into a loss. You are losing something. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he speaks about riba, when he speaks about usury, he points out very specifically that people believe that by charging this particular principle on individuals in exchange for giving them loans or giving them money, that this is what will give rise to increase. But in fact, it is not usurious exchanges that give rise to increase in people's wealth. Rather, it is what you give in charity, in desiring the approval of God, in desiring the pleasure of God. It is these people who are going to gain increase in their provision and in their wealth manifold. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about the increase that charity brings, He is flipping the script. And part of flipping the script is to really test people to see, do you actually trust in the wa'ad or the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That Allah has promised you that when you give away your wealth for His sake, that He will increase you further. Do you actually believe in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or are you someone who lacks that husn dhan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You lack that certainty in what He is promising you. And so you are miserly and you hoard your wealth because you feel that parting from it is actually a form of loss and not a form of increasing yourself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also points out over here that richness, when we talk about increase through charity, that richness is actually richness of the soul, right? What ultimately counts is that this act of zakat that you're engaging in is purifying you. It is purifying your wealth. And since wealth is connected to your person, it has the effect of purifying yourself as well. And in the purification of yourself and your wealth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will further increase your provision. And in that transformation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala signals that richness, that ghina, is ultimately what counts is ghina of your soul, finding freedom in your own spirit, and not what you hold in your hand in terms of wealth. And so this challenges our perceptions. This challenges the way we tend to live, which is we see that it is hoarding wealth, saving wealth, that is what increases our wealth, not giving to other people. This is what safeguards our provision, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that no, change your perception regarding this and see charity for what it is and what I have promised it to be, which is a form of you increasing not only in your wealth, but also in your state. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an that وَمَا أَنفَقْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَهُوَ يُخْلِفُهُ وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الرَّازِقِينَ. But whatever you spend in His cause, He will compensate it, right? فَهُوَ يُخْلِفُهُ, and He is the best of providers. So do you believe that He is the best of providers? And if you do believe that He is the best of providers, do you actually reflect that in doing infaq, in spending in His way? And do you actually believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate you for it? And the compensation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always be greater than what you have offered in His way. What we see in this definition of zakat is there's a type of cycle that gets created for the human being. You give zakat, you purify yourself, Allah increases you further in your provision, and then you give zakat on that increase. Then you purify yourself, Allah increases you further. And so there's like a cycle of purification that becomes created as a result of zakat, which if you get caught in can be, a very, very, very positive and good thing. The idea of increase is, of course, more than just wealth. It is, as I mentioned, an increase in one's own state and one's own, the blessings, all of the blessings that a person experiences around him. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, in a very famous surah, فَأَمَّا مَنْ أَعْطَى وَاتَّقَى وَصَدَّقَ بِالْحُسْنَى فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى. That there is the one who gives, who is mindful of God, who testifies to goodness, we shall smooth his way towards ease. وَأَمَّا مَنْ بَخِلَ وَاسْتَغْنَى وَكَذَّبَ بِالْحُسْنَى فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْعُسْرَى. As for the one who is miserly, who is self-satisfied, who denies goodness, we shall smooth his way towards hardship. And so this general idea of increase links to the idea of not just increase in your provision, but increase in just the facilitation or the ease that you experience in your own life. And so the increase that zakat and charity more generally brings upon is something that needs to be seen in this or from this wider perspective. The second thing is, what is zakat given on? And again, the reason I'm focusing on this is because a lot of times we know these things as legal rules, but we don't really reflect often on why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set down these legal rules, right? The legal rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set down for us to follow were not just arbitrary. They were not purposeless. They were there for a reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant for them to be prescribed in this specific way, and they were ultimately meant for our own benefit. When we look at what zakat is given on, you will notice that there are three main factors that underpin what zakat is given on. Firstly, zakat is given not on all wealth, it is given on a specific type of wealth, right? It is given on gold, silver, trade goods, and certain types of livestock. And what all these items of wealth share is that they are all items of wealth that have a strong potential to increase in value, or they are intended or set aside for that particular purpose, right? When you have trade goods, for example, the reason you have trade goods is because you want to create some profit out of those goods. Gold and silver, by their nature, fluctuate in terms of their prices, and so by by owning gold and silver, you own an item that can potentially increase in value. Livestock was also the same. So all the items of wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated zakat on were items of wealth that had the potential for an increase in value, or were intended for the endeavor of some type of profit making. When it comes to this particular wealth, zakat is only due on excess wealth, right? So zakat is not only due on specific wealth, but only on such wealth when it reaches a specific amount beyond one's immediate needs and beyond one's debts. And so when you calculate zakat, you subtract your immediate needs, you subtract your debts, and then from these specific wealth items of gold, silver, trade goods, certain types of livestock, you calculate whether you have the minimal threshold of an excess. And if you do, which is what we call the nisab, you pay 2.5% on this excess wealth. So it is on specific wealth, but only the excess of that specific wealth beyond your immediate needs and debts. And finally, that zakat on that excess of specific wealth is only due after one entire year has passed over that particular wealth. That is when zakat becomes due. When you look at all these rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put down, what we are seeing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to ensure that humans engage in this particular act of purification and this particular act of charity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated zakat in a manner where it can be done with ease, where it can be done with gratitude, and where it can be done with willingness. How do these things connect to these ideas? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not telling you to pay zakat on the entirety of your wealth. He's only telling you to pay zakat on specific types of wealth. He is not forcing you to pay zakat if you are not able to cover your immediate needs, if you are in debt. He's only obligating you to cover zakat when your wealth is in excess. And he's only obligating you to pay that zakat after the passing of a year. There are a lot of meanings that come out when we look at these rulings of zakat. We see firstly that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really facilitative in terms of him wanting people to fulfill this obligation. He does not want to burden people. And this is something that we saw also in the verses on fasting, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that if you are marid, or if you are ala safarin, or traveling, then fasting is not obligatory upon you. You can make those fasts up at a later date, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yuridu bikum al-yusra wa la yuridu bikum al-usra. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends ease for you, He does not intend difficulty. Zakat is reflecting that same idea. By focusing on excess wealth, zakat is reminding the human being, it's trying to make him conscious of the fact that he does possess excess wealth, that he has the blessings of excess that a lot of other people do not have. By giving away that excess, it is reminding the human being that this world is a world in which we should have some level of zuhud, that we should not be living a life of excess. We should rather be taking at least some of this excess, and we should be directing it towards people and towards things that are in need of what we possess more than we are. And so simply in the rules of zakat, when we look at specific wealth, when we look at the fact that it is on excess, when we look at the fact that it is on wealth that only increases or has the potential to increase, or is being used with the intention of gaining profit, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to remind us of this blessings of excess that he has given some human beings. And he is trying, even in obligating charity on that excess, he is trying to facilitate the human ability to pay charity and to give zakat by giving them this period of a year, by not obligating it on all their wealth, and so on and so forth. And so when we reflect on the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set down for us, we need to try and see deeper what is this rule trying to convey to me about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself as someone who deeply cares for his creation and wants success for them and wants to facilitate matters for them. And also about what does this tell me about myself and about all the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me. And so when we think of this idea of zakat as being wealth simply on excess, this is of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala almost prodding us towards the the most the most basic form of charity that we should all be engaged in, which is our excess wealth having reached a specific threshold, 2.5% of it should be directed towards the poor and needy in the community. There are, of course, higher levels of charitable giving, and the level of the prophets and the level of those who are really immersed in Tawheed and in recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whose husn al or whose good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is complete, as Imam Al-Ghazali mentions in his Ihya, is they pretty much renounced all of their wealth. And this was the way of the Prophet ﷺ. This was the way of the people like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who is known, as we know from what we hear about his seerah or his life, that he gave away all his wealth to the Prophet ﷺ. And it is expressed as a desire of the Prophet in a famous hadith in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet said, "Nothing is more delighting to me than that Uhud, the mountain of Uhud, should be made of gold for me, and no dinar is left with me from it before 3 nights pass, except a single dinar, which I would set aside for the repayment of debt upon me." Meaning, I will get rid of everything. If I were to be given gold the size of Uhud, I would give it all away. I would only keep for myself what is required for me to repay someone who I owe money to, because that is his right to be repaid. But everything else I would give away in charity. And so this is a very high station, the station of the prophets. And zakat kind of pushes us, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nudging us towards, towards more charitable giving in the path of the prophets by first focusing on at least being charitable with the excess wealth that we possess. Finally, we've taken the definition of zakat. What is zakat due upon in terms of wealth? And then finally, to whom is zakat given? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again in the Qur'an mentions very clearly whom zakat is to be given to, that إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم. Zakat is meant only for the poor, the needy, those who administer them, those whose hearts need winning over, to free slaves and help those in debt, for God's cause, fi sabilillah, and for travelers in need. This is what has been ordained by God. God is all-knowing and wise. There are two meanings that underpin these zakat recipients, or the general idea that is being conveyed by this verse. First of all, it is about something about human inviolability, something about human sanctity. This is how I like to frame from the very get-go this idea of charitable giving to human beings. That we saw in previous lessons that there's a certain inviolability that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has extended to the human being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He created the human being in the best of forms. He gave the human being hearing, sight, and intellects. He subjugated the world to human beings. He honored, لَقَدْ قَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We've honored the children of Adam. We have provided them of good things, and we have favored them, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we have favored them especially above many of those whom we have created. And of course, the human being, his inviolability also comes from this divine spark, this ruh, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put inside him, that sets him apart from many other of creation. The believer in specific, of course, is even more honored in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and even more inviolable. And the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith in Bukhari, verily your lives, your property, and your honor are sacred to one another. Right? He's speaking to the believers that your lives, your property, and your honor are all sacred to one another. And so when we recognize the sanctity of the human being as the most unique creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially the believer who has said La ilaha illallah, and by saying La ilaha illallah, by acknowledging and recognizing Tawheed, has aligned himself with everything else in the created realm. Because everything else in the created realm is by its tabi'ah, by its very nature, submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Human beings are the only creation that have the ability to be an aberration from Tawheed. The birds, the cattle, the trees, the rocks, the mountains, the stars, the angels, everything that you see around you has already submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They recognize the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is only human beings and jinn that have the capacity to not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be an aberration from what we see in the rest of the cosmos. And so the believer has a unique honor to him. And so when we look at this human sanctity and inviolability and honor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has extended to the human beings, then we also honor creation. We also respect creation. And one way of honoring them and one way of expressing the sanctity and the sacredness of their lives and their honor with the believer is to be in their aid and support, particularly the weakest amongst them. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has stipulated zakat for these types of people, first and foremost, as a reminder of the inviolability of the human being, and particularly the duty on us in respect to that sacredness that human beings more generally, and then believers more specifically, imbibe within themselves, that we are in their aid and we are in their support. But zakat, through this idea of honoring and recognition of inviolability, is not an act of charity that is simply extended to an individual. It is an act of worship that we perform that is intimately linked to the creation of a community. This is, of course, something that we see in many of the rituals of Islam, such as Salah and Saum and others. But zakat, when we say it is a pillar of Islam, this is what we mean, which is that a community is formed of individuals. And by giving individuals security, and by giving individuals aid, and by extending our hands to individuals, and by making individuals realize that there are other people who are there to watch out for them, to care for them, who have concern for them, then this is really what creates communities. And the Prophet, ﷺ, of course, he said, the Muslims are like a single man. If the eye is afflicted, the whole body is afflicted, right? Meaning, if one individual from our ummah, from our community, is in pain, is in distress, is in poverty, that should pain every single Muslim. And by extending our zakat to the poorest of the poor within our community, the most neediest, we are signaling to them that they are part of this ummah, that the ummah cares for them, that the ummah has concern for them, and that every single individual in this ummah counts. And every single person in this ummah is needed in order for that ummah to maintain its strength. And one way it maintains its strength, this ummah, as a believing community, is that security of well-being and security of living oftentimes correlates into security of faith. People who are not connected to the community, people who feel like the community does not care for them, this sometimes impacts not only their well-being, but also their very iman itself. And so all the rituals of Islam are meant to bring people together in a way that first and foremost cultivates their iman, and by cultivating their iman, cultivates the iman of the entire community as well, and their own well-being and their own directedness towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the opposite of course, what the disbeliever does. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the disbeliever in the Quran that he says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا يُنْفِقُونَ أَمْوَالَهُم لِيَصُدُّوا عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. They use their wealth to bar people from the path of God. Whereas zakat is being used to direct people, the poorest amongst us, to the path of God. But there is something even more deeper about zakat being directed to the poor and the needy in our tradition. It's a very deeply existential in a communal sense point of view, which is that not only does these acts of charitable giving, not only does it create a community of believers and it makes Islam strong, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, part of his promise is that communities who do not look after the most vulnerable amongst them are communities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised will not thrive. In Sunan al-Nasa'i, the Prophet ﷺ said, verily, Allah only supports this nation. He only supports this ummah because of their weak and their poor, their supplications, and their sincerity. And he also said, as related by Ibn Majah, that a nation will not be sanctified if the weak cannot take their rights without surmounting obstacles. And in something that indicates a more profound cosmic effect that this has, the Prophet ﷺ said, never do people withhold their zakat from their wealth, but that a portion from the sky will be held back for them. Were not for the animals, it would never rain, right? That when people hold back their zakat, these fundamental aspects of rizq that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down to allow us to live and to nourish ourselves, such as the rain, right? This is what the Prophet means by a portion from the sky, that this will be withheld. And the only reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down the rain, even while we withhold our zakat, or while people withhold their zakat, is because the animals that exist amongst us. Because of course they haven't done anything wrong. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still going to give them their rizq. And so it is because of these animals that we are getting our rizq. But the Prophet says that the act of holding back your zakat from your wealth, this should result in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withholding a portion from the sky from you. What this indicates is the very existence of us as a community. The very existence of us as a community that is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sanctified rests on how we treat the poor amongst us. The supplications of the poor do not come when the community has neglected those poor people. And so zakat has this very strong element of creating a community. Finally, zakat, of course, just gets into the idea of charity more generally, right? It points us more generally to the act of charity, and charity conveys a fundamental message, which is that the wealth and the material possessions that we have in our hands is actually not ours. It is a constant reminder of this. Charity is a constant reminder of the fact that we do not own what we possess. And the recognition that we are not true owners of what we possess is, of course, a fundamental sign of a believer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, say, Prophet, ask them, who provides for you from the sky and the earth? And they will say, Allah, right? The sign of a believer is someone who recognizes that the provision that he is giving is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In a very interesting exchange between the Prophet Shu'aib and the people that he's giving da'wah to, there's a very interesting passage in the Quran where the people that Shu'aib is giving da'wah to, they say, Shu'aib, does your prayer tell you that we should abandon what our forefathers worshipped and refrain from doing whatever we please with our own property? وَأَن تَفْعَلَ فِي أَمْوَالِنَا مَا نَشَاءُ. They ascribe the property to themselves. Amwalina, this is our property. This is their perspective on what they possess, that they are the true owners of this, that this belongs to them, that this is their property. And Shu'aib's response is very, very insightful. It's very profound. It's very strong. When he answered, my people, can you not see? What if I'm acting on clear evidence from my Lord? What if this da'wah that I'm giving you is based on clear evidence from my Lord? He himself has given me good provision, right? وَرَزَقَنِي مِنْهُ رِزْقًا حَسَنًا. And so Shu'aib again flips the script around on these people. These people see their wealth as their wealth, where Shu'aib is saying, alayhi salam, that no, this is the rizq that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me. This idea of rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Razaq. And this allows us to, again, hone in on charity as an act of giving, as a reflection of something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself does, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Razzaq is himself is the ultimate giver. We are reflecting something of the divine when we also become the givers of what is in our possession. And when you think about it, everything ultimately that we experience around us is an act of giving. Our life is an act of giving. We experience giving at every moment of our existence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Ar-Rahim is the one who gave us our existence, who gave us our life, who gives us our breath. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Ar-Razaq is the one who gives us our provisions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as someone who sends us the Qur'an. The Qur'an is a giver of guidance. The Prophet ﷺ is a giver of good news. Everything that we experience around us is an act of giving, is an act of giving. All these manifestations that we see are the divine gifts of giving that we experience. So the way of giving or the path of giving is the divine path. It is the prophetic path. It is the Quranic path. And this giving is a giving of more than wealth. It is a giving of your life, of your breath to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a giving of your wealth to those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told you to give to from the poor, from the family. It is a giving of a smile. It is a giving of a good word. It is a giving of guidance to people. It is a giving of standing for the oppressed. It is a giving of seeing everything around you as something that is a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so your heart becomes detached from these things and it becomes easy for you to share them amongst those who deserve that it be shared with. And so this act of giving is very powerful in the Quran. It is very powerful as something that really allows us to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his being as the being of someone who gives. And so this is something that zakat and charity more generally should allow us to focus on. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these final 10 days to make us people who give, who not only give from our wealth, but give from our very spirits and from our being to all those around us, to our families, to the poor and needy amongst our community, to those who are oppressed, to those who are in difficulty, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to become individuals who give and give and give, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will continue increasing us and He will continue allowing us to give, and He will never tire from that, as long as we continue to strive in that path. And so inshallah, I will stop there. And if anyone has any questions, I will inshallah take those questions. We can maybe wait a minute or two to see if people do have any questions. In the meantime, once again, this is the final week that we have in our Ramadan program. And so please be sure to try to benefit from the remaining lectures that we have from people like Dr. Ramon and Dr. Rothman, Sheikh Suleiman, and Dr. Rania and others. And of course, do support the college by sharing the material if you found any benefit in it, or by donating, or by sending your children to the college for a BA or diploma if you want to do that. But any help is, of course, appreciated, and inshallah, it will be written in your mizan of hasanat in the next life and be a form of sadaqah jariyah for all of us. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He bless us in these final nights and that He give aid and comfort to all those Muslims everywhere who are suffering and who are needy and who are having difficult life circumstances, and that He allow us to be a means for them to be in their aid and respite. So if there are no questions, inshallah, we can just conclude over there. Barakallahu fikum, and I hope everyone benefited from these from my lectures at least. And I hope to speak to everyone again in the future. And I hope all of your Ramadan is blessed, and a advanced Eid Mubarak from me as well. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.